First Minister's questions. Leonard.
Presiding Officer, yesterday afternoon, the First Minister announced that she does not believe that the Prime Minister is ready to give ground on a Brexit deal. The Labour Party also continues to vehemently oppose a no-deal Brexit. And today we have returned in good faith to make concerted efforts to avoid that no-deal Brexit. But there is no escaping the fact that thanks to Theresa May and the Tories, we are now facing the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit. So can the First Minister update Parliament and the country on her government's Resilience Committee's plans in the event of a no-deal Brexit next week?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government Resilience Committee will meet again this afternoon. I will chair that meeting, as I have chaired meetings on a weekly basis for some time now. We are planning across the whole range of our responsibilities to ensure that as far as we possibly can, we mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit. I'll be very candid with the Chamber. No matter how much planning or contingency work we do, it will not be possible to mitigate every impact of a no-deal Brexit should that happen, which is why it is so important all of us work to avoid that scenario arising. Yesterday in Westminster, I had firstly a very constructive meeting with Jeremy Corbyn. I also met with the Prime Minister. In the meeting with the Prime Minister, I set out to her again the Scottish Government's Single Market Customs Union compromise. That's not our first preference, but I said I was willing to look at, with the Prime Minister, where there may be issues of agreement around that. I also said I was willing and keen to talk to her about how we could allay, for example, our concerns about migration, given the demographic needs of Scotland. All I really got in return from the Prime Minister was the reasons why she didn't agree with me on these things and why her deal was actually the best one. So she wants to know where the rest of us are prepared to compromise, but I got no sense at all from her at any stage yesterday of where she is willing to compromise. And I think from what I read after his meeting with her, Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues got pretty much the same impression. So if the Prime Minister wants to find a compromise, it's time she started to set out where she is prepared to compromise. And it's also time that everybody across the House of Commons unites behind initiatives like Joanna Cherry's motion earlier this week to make sure we take the risk of a no-deal Brexit away once and for all and forever.
Richard Leonard.
Can I welcome that cooperative tone? But let's focus on something specific. Let's focus on something specific to the Scottish situation, because last week the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer said that steps were being taken to deal with any shortfall of medicines as a result of a no-deal Brexit. The Health Secretary previously stated that the government wanted to have 6 weeks' notice, 6 weeks' worth of medicine in storage on top of normal stock levels by the end of March. Medicines like insulin, which over 30,000 people in Scotland rely on every day. So can the First Minister take this opportunity to reassure the public that Scotland now has access to 6 weeks' worth of reserves of all the medicines that we need?
First Minister.
That is the broad assurance we have from pharmaceutical companies. Of course, we continue to work to make sure that information is up to date and that those stockpiles remain, given that, of course, the date for a possible no-deal Brexit has changed and may change again. So these plans require to be kept under constant and ongoing review, and I can assure the Chamber that they will be. Obviously, we hope we are not in this situation. The presiding officer has indicated that if we are facing a no-deal Brexit at the end of next week, Parliament will be recalled from recess. I welcome that assurance, and the government then will have the opportunity to set out up-to-date, up-to-the-minute date details of the preparations across a whole range of these issues. Presiding officer, I couldn't help but notice that while Richard Leonard was asking me that very important and serious question, the Conservative benches were laughing. This is not a laughing matter. And every Conservative in this chamber and every Conservative politician across the country should be hanging their heads in shame at the fact that they have brought this country to the brink of crisis.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? And let me turn to something else which is extremely serious. the Finance Secretary said that Brexit would represent an economic shock on the scale of the 2008 global financial crisis. So in the foreword to his budget, he said, and I can quote him, "However, if we face a no-deal or cliff-edge Brexit, I will have to return to Parliament to reassess our spending priorities." So when will the First Minister bring to this Parliament those revised spending priorities, and will she commit to presenting her proposals for consideration by Parliament next week in the event of a recall in the light of a no-deal Brexit possibility?
First Minister.
This is a serious issue. So let me say firstly, I hope the Finance Secretary does not have to return to Parliament with revised budget figures, because I hope we don't find ourselves in a no-deal scenario. If we do find ourselves in that scenario, it will be important that the Finance Secretary does that as quickly as possible. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that to be next Thursday or Friday, but as soon as possible after that, for full consideration by the Parliament, he would intend to do that. If we are in this scenario, and as I say, let's all hope that that is not the case, there will be a substantial shock to the UK economy and to the Scottish economy. Within that, we will do whatever we can to mitigate the impacts of this, but many of these levers lie in the hands of the UK government. Firstly, many of the levers that would allow us to avoid a no-deal scenario, but also the levers that will require to be pulled if we find ourselves in that situation. When I was in London yesterday, also took part in the Cabinet Subcommittee, UK Cabinet Subcommittee on no-deal planning. John Swinney and Mike Russell have attended previous meetings of that subcommittee. One of the issues on the agenda was the UK government's planning for the economic response, and I made the point that I don't think the scale of what they're planning is sufficient to meet the potential scale of the challenge. So we will continue to do what we can, everything we can, and press the UK government to do likewise. But I repeat again, and this is an important, very important point, if we find ourselves leaving the European Union next week or at any stage with no deal, then we will, none of us, be able to properly and fully mitigate the impacts of that, which is why all of us should be focused on doing everything we possibly can to stop that happening.
Willie Rennie.
I want to ask some questions on an area of agreement. I share the First Minister's anxiety that there may be a hasty Brexit agreement between the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister. And because that agreement will not be in the withdrawal agreement, it could be unpicked by Boris Johnson if he takes over from Theresa May later this year. When she met Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, did she get an indication about how he was going to address this issue? And on a people's vote, it seems clear to me that if there is an agreement between the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party, there will be no people's vote. Is that her understanding?
First Minister.
Well, on the first issue, I am very concerned that a deal may lead to a legally binding withdrawal agreement being passed that would irrevocably take the UK out of the EU on the strength of non-legally binding commitments about the future relationship that could, as Willie Rennie says, be ripped up by a future Prime Minister, perish the thought, such as Boris Johnson. That is a concern I expressed strongly to Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues yesterday, and it's up to him whether he wants to listen to me, but said if I was in his shoes, I would be very, very wary about doing a deal on that basis with the Prime Minister. In terms of a people's vote, it wasn't clear to me from my discussions with Jeremy Corbyn yesterday which way the Labour Party will go on that issue. There is obviously a division within the Labour Party, that's fair enough, but I think it is absolutely vital, given the mess that this process has become, that what we don't see is a cobbled together, behind closed doors, least worst compromise cooked up between the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. Far better now to request a long extension from the EU, to fight the European elections to make that possible. By all means then to allow the Commons to come up with what a compromise might look like, but then ask the people across the UK whether they want to accept a second best compromise, or whether actually now, given everything we've learned over the past 3 years, they might think the best option for the whole of the UK is to remain in the EU.
Willie Rennie.
I think that's right, because we Remainers are concerned that a deal could be done behind closed doors, giving away the real benefits of the European Union without having the people having that final say. I just want to be clear about compromise. She's talked about it today, she talked about it yesterday. She's referred to our paper in 2016 that talked about single market membership and also the customs union. That was her main position until I charmed her to support the people's vote. Well, she did change her mind after I asked her. Can I have some clarity about what she now means about compromise? Will she insist on a people's vote in all circumstances, or is she considering reverting to her original position?
First Minister.
I would encourage Willie Rennie to keep up with the charm. I think it is much more befitting of his status in this Parliament. But I want to see a people's vote in all circumstances. I think I've tried to set this out before. This is not a situation of my choosing. It's not a situation of Willie Rennie's choosing. My preference is for Scotland to remain in the EU, and I will do everything I can to try to bring that option about. But if we are faced with that choice no longer at any stage, and I hope this is not the case, with that choice no longer being open to the UK, it will always be open to Scotland down a different route that I continue to hope to charm Willie Rennie into agreeing with. But if that option is no longer available to the UK, then I will want to protect Scotland against a hard Brexit. And that's why we've put forward previously, and indeed voted in the House of Commons on Monday night, for a single market customs union compromise. But that is not my preference. So right now, I think those of us who want to see this Brexit mess stopped in its track, and the UK given the option of staying in the EU, should continue to be fully behind efforts to put this issue back to the people. I think that's the right thing to do now. Indeed, I think it's the most democratic thing to do now.
Rowley, to be followed by Jamie Greene. Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, it's now clear that Fife has lost out on the £2.8 billion worth of work from the Murray and Kincardine wind farm projects. In fact, it is a fact that as part of that consent for Kincardine, there was commitments given to substantial amounts of work to be done in Scottish yards. What is the First Minister going to do about developers reneging on those commitments to Scottish yards? And given that the Fife yards are owned by Scottish enterprise, what action plan is going to be put in place to ensure that investment comes into the Fife yards to ensure that they are fit for the future?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Alex Rowley for raising this issue? I, with the Finance Secretary, met with DF Barnes last week, the owners now of BiFab, and we had the opportunity to discuss their understandable frustrations that we share about the recent experience of bidding for some of these contracts. We also discussed issues around investment in and infrastructure at the yards, and we were able to assure the company that we will continue to do everything we can to support them, and those discussions are ongoing. We also discussed, and I know this is an issue that has been raised by Gary Smith and Pat Rafferty of the unions concerned, about real concerns about whether or not, and probably not, BiFab is operating on a level playing field. I think I said when Alex Rowley last raised this issue that we're going to convene a summit to look at some of those issues and try to get to the heart of that, because I believe strongly, very, very strongly, that BiFab should have, and indeed does have, a bright future if we can resolve some of these issues. And I'm absolutely determined that working with the company, working with the unions and working with others, we will resolve these issues and make sure this company does have the future it deserves.
Jamie Greene.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've raised the issue of free personal care in this chamber numerous times with the First Minister. Just yesterday I received correspondence confirming that in North Ayrshire is a backlog of 100 people waiting for funding. The correspondence from the Health and Social Care Partnership reads, free personal care can only be provided within available financial means, but due to budgetary pressures, there is a waiting list for funding. Every one of those people are waiting for funding, for a solution to meet their needs. First Minister, if free personal care is so universal, then why are so many waiting?
First Minister.
Well, free personal care is there, has been there for many years for those over 65 who are assessed as needing it. Of course, as of Monday this week, it has been extended to those under 65s. I'm happy to look at the correspondence, have the Health Secretary look at the correspondence if the member wishes to pass it to us. But it is important that we work with integration authorities to make sure that those who are assessed as needing care get it. Of course, I'd say, gently, we would, if we followed the Tory proposals on our budget, of course, we'd have to be taking hundreds of millions of pounds out of the budgets of the health service and integration authorities. We are increasing the money that's going to the health service, we're increasing money that's going into social care, and of course those are proposals for increased funding that the Tories voted against when this Parliament considered the budget.
And Stewart Stevenson.
This week we heard Michelle Ballantyne say, "I would be quite happy if the government had nothing to do with the running of the NHS." This is a lady who received her education as a nurse from the NHS, who worked in the NHS. Is it not absolute Tory hypocrisy that she now seeks to undermine the NHS?
First Minister.
I think the Scottish Conservatives are probably starting to wish that Michelle Ballantyne would make fewer interventions in this chamber. But obviously, I was in London yesterday. I wasn't in the chamber. I didn't hear the comments. I have seen them as reported. And I think, well, as far as I'm concerned, the NHS must always stay in public ownership, in public hands, run by the public. And as long as I or my party have anything to do with it, that will continue to be the case. But I do think Michelle Ballantyne's comments yesterday will underline the concern that many people have that the NHS would not be safe in Conservative hands because they'd want to privatise it at the first opportunity they got.
Briggs.
To ask the First Minister whether she will provide details of the scope and remit of the Scottish Government's new task force to tackle drug deaths.
First Minister.
The Public Health Minister will convene an expert group to examine the key drivers of drug deaths and advise on what further changes, either in practice or in the law, could help save lives and reduce harm. As was outlined in the new drug and alcohol strategy a few months ago, we must recognise that there are limitations in relation to public health outcomes associated with the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. It's also the case, of course, as I think everybody appreciates, that the issue of drug deaths is complex. No one approach, one group or one service can do all that is needed. So it's important that we make sure everybody is working together. And the expert group that is being established will also learn from the Dundee and Glasgow work on drug deaths to help inform our continued efforts to tackle this issue.
Briggs.
Does the First Minister understand the frustration of families across Scotland that it's taken the SNP government so long to wake up to this tragedy across our country? Anna Sawar, Monica Leonard and myself called for this action over the last 3 years, and SNP ministers have failed to act. Now, given the level of concern about drug deaths across our country, how will the First Minister make sure that colleagues across this chamber are part of this task force, that experts and charities, many of whom agree with us that it's time we urgently see a new focus on helping people end and not just manage their addictions? How will everyone be included to make sure that work's taken forward?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue to work across the chamber to do the right things in what is a complex and challenging issue. I represent a constituency, as the member knows, in Glasgow. I regularly speak to those who have experience of drug use and families who have been affected by drug use, and those conversations often underline for me the complexity of this issue, but also some of the things that we need to do. And I think it's important, as I said in an exchange a couple of weeks ago with Jackson Carlaw, that we are prepared to look not just at some of the traditional actions we take, but at new approaches as well. The issue of safe consumption facilities is one that is raised regularly in this chamber, which the Tories, in a seemingly knee-jerk way, have just set their face completely against. And, you know, the Home Office actually wrote in a letter to the Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership that they acknowledge that there is some evidence for the effectiveness of drug consumption rooms in reducing health risks for drug users. So if we're to be serious about this, all of us have to be serious about it. All of us have to have the humility to accept that some things in the past haven't worked, and we have to be prepared to have new approaches. But that cuts both ways. If opposition parties want, as I hope they do, to be part of this, then I would again ask the member to rethink this issue, and when he has done so, perhaps use any influence he has in the UK government to change their position on this, because changing on their position on this would be one way of helping us take these issues forward in a positive way.
John Finnie.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I thank the First Minister for her comments? She's aware of the clamour for action about this public health crisis. There's a clamour too, First Minister, from people with drug problems to get opiate replacement therapy. The figure at the moment is 35% in Scotland, it's 60% in England, and a third of the drug-related deaths in 2014, the individuals had no contact with drug treatment. Some issues, and I welcome the task force and its anticipated work, Some issues can't wait. Will the First Minister, as a matter of urgency, address an acceptably low percentage of people with drug problems in treatment and ensure optimum prescribing and support to tackle the unacceptable level of deaths?
First Minister.
I am happy to ensure that this is an issue that is looked at. I'm sure this is an issue that has been and is being looked at, that it may be something that the expert group wants to look at in the early stages of its work. Obviously, prescribing decisions are for clinicians to take based on the best interests and the needs of those that they're prescribing for. But the disparity that John Finnie has just cited there in terms of opiate replacement prescribing rates is certainly something that I think in the full scope of this work should be looked at. My view on this is that nothing should be off the agenda here. This is a serious, complex, challenging issue. Some things that are already being done we know are effective. Other things are perhaps not effective, and there are things that are not currently being done that we have to open our minds to. And I think if everybody involved has that spirit, then here in Scotland, as we have done in so many other public health issues, can find a way of leading in the right direction on this, and that's what I hope we can achieve.
And question 6, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government response is to reports that many pregnant women and homeless children are being housed by local authorities in substandard temporary accommodation.
First Minister.
Temporary accommodation provides an important safety net in emergencies, and our Ending Homelessness Together action plan is very clear that this accommodation must be high quality with stays as short as possible. The vast majority of families with children or pregnant women are given temporary accommodation in the social rented sector. For others, the unsuitable accommodation order provides extra protection to ensure that families don't stay in unsuitable accommodation, for example, bed and breakfast, for more than 7 days. Breaches of that should not be tolerated, and the Housing Minister has already met with councils concerned to discuss solutions. As part of our plans to transform temporary accommodation later this year, we will also consult on extending that protection to all homeless households, and the consultation will ask for views on suitable sanctions for any council that fails to comply.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. I know that the First Minister talks about high-quality temporary accommodation, but all over the country people are being put in smelly, run-down private hotels and bed and breakfast, mainly due to a lack of social housing stock at exorbitant cost to the taxpayer. The Herald on Sunday confirmed horror stories of single rooms in grotty hotels with no cooker, no fridge, and residents being locked out for being 5 minutes late in getting to their accommodation. In some cases, there's nothing temporary about some temporary accommodation. I would ask the First Minister if we could focus on what could be done immediately to recognise the scandal. I know there's a lot of ongoing work, but would the First Minister kick into touch recommendation 20 of Social Bite Commission's report, which looks at enforcing legally enforceable standards for temporary accommodation, starting with at least the right to a cooker and the right to a fridge?
First Minister.
Yes, we will consider all recommendations of that nature. As I said in my original answer, one of the things we will consult on are suitable sanctions for councils who are not complying with the rules in this area. I think it's important to say that the vast majority of families are in temporary accommodation in the socially rented sector. We have that time protection now for families, women with children and pregnant women, and that's what we're looking to extend. And breaches of that, in part the increase in breaches is due to the restriction of the time limit, but breaches are not acceptable, which is why the Housing Minister has been taking action with the councils concerned. But the recommendations that came from our task force, we are determined to implement those recommendations so that we transform temporary accommodation, but also in a broader sense reduce the circumstances in which anybody has to go into temporary accommodation in the first place.
Thank you, and that concludes First Minister's questions, but a point of order first from Mr Stevenson.
Earlier in questions, Tom Mason raised an issue relating to teachers in Aberdeen. I'm aware, as some others will be, that he is the councillor for Midstockett and Rosemount in Aberdeen. I'm sure it was utterly inadvertent on his part not to draw our attention to that fact. Will you now give him the opportunity to put on the record that he had an interest in the matter he raised?
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. That is neither a point of order and, as you will know, is a matter for members' judgment whether or not to declare an interest. That concludes First Minister's questions.